Have you ever stopped to wonder if the things that happen in our childhoods, the things we often just try to push away, could actually leave a physical mark? Not just on our memories, but deep inside our very cells? What if those experiences could be quietly shaping our health for our entire lives? Well, today, we're going to pull back the curtain on exactly that.
So let's just dive right in. I mean, it sounds like a huge leap, right? How could a tough time as a kid lead to something like heart disease or diabetes as an adult? But here's the thing, it's not a mystery. It's biology. We're going to follow the hidden pathways that connect our past to our present health, and you'll see how our earliest experiences literally get written into our bodies.
We tend to think of trauma as, well, a wound to the mind, an emotional scar. But what if that was just the part you can see? What if it's the tip of the iceberg for a much deeper physical injury? Let's dig into that. This right here is the fundamental truth that decades of research have uncovered. It turns out groundbreaking studies have found this incredibly powerful, undeniable link between facing adversity as a kid and, well, the biggest causes of death in adults. This isn't about someone being weak or just needing to get over it. No, this is about a biological process where our early life literally gets under our skin, changing how our brains and our bodies work forever.
So, how do we even begin to map out this connection? Well, scientists came up with a framework that honestly changed everything. It's called the ACE pyramid, and it gives us a clear way to see the chain reaction, to understand the lifelong effects of what happens when we're young. The term ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it came out of this huge landmark study back in the 90s. The researchers defined ACEs as potentially traumatic events that happen any time before you turn 18. And let's be clear, we're not talking about the normal stresses of growing up. We're talking about serious, overwhelming experiences. And the most shocking thing they found? These experiences are way, way more common than anyone ever thought.
So, what kind of things are we actually talking about? The original study focused on 10 specific types of adversity, which basically fall into 3 buckets. You've got abuse, that's physical and emotional, then there's neglect, and the third bucket is household dysfunction, which covers things like growing up with a parent who has a mental illness or a substance abuse problem, seeing violence in the home, or even having a family member who is incarcerated. And this is maybe the most important discovery from all that research. It wasn't one specific kind of trauma that was the biggest predictor of future problems. No, it was the cumulative number of ACEs a person had. Scientists have a term for this, a dose-response relationship. Think of it like medicine. The higher the dose of adversity you experience, the stronger the response is in terms of your risk for all sorts of negative health outcomes later on.
And this chart really brings that dose-response effect to life. What you're seeing here is the risk for adult depression based on someone's ACE score. So for a person with an ACE score of 0, you've got your baseline risk. But look what happens with a score of just 2. It jumps up quite a bit. And for someone with an ACE score of 4 or more, the risk of depression is suddenly several times higher. And this pattern, this traumatic increase, it holds true for so many other health conditions. It's incredible.
Okay, so we've got the what figured out. More ACEs equals higher risk. But that brings us to the really big question. How? How on earth does an emotional experience from when you are 5 or 10 years old cause a physical illness when you're 40 or 50? Well, the answer is in the way our bodies are built to remember stress.
The science really points to 3 main biological pathways that turn childhood adversity into long-term physical changes. You can think of it like a domino effect. First, the body's alarm system just goes completely haywire. That, in turn, actually changes the physical structure, the architecture of a child's developing brain. And then, believe it or not, these experiences can even edit the instruction manual for our very own genes. All right, let's start with that alarm system. We all have this built-in stress response. In a healthy situation, a threat shows up, the alarm turns on, our body releases stress hormones like cortisol to help us deal with it, and then, and this is the key part, when the threat is gone, the system shuts off. But for a child living with ACEs, the threat often never goes away. The alarm gets stuck in the on position. This is what scientists call toxic stress. The body is just flooded with cortisol day in and day out, and it never gets to go back to normal. It's like living in a house where the fire alarm is blaring 24/7. And this constant state of alarm does real physical damage to a developing brain. That flood of stress hormones is literally toxic to brain cells, and it changes key parts of the brain. The prefrontal cortex, which is kind of like the brain's brake pedal for controlling impulses, it can actually shrink. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, becomes overactive, which can leave a person feeling anxious and on high alert all the time. And the hippocampus, which is crucial for memory and mood, also shrinks. And I want to be clear, these aren't just metaphors, these are measurable, physical changes to the brain.
Now for the third mechanism, and honestly, this one is pretty mind-blowing. It's called epigenetics. See, we used to think our DNA was our destiny, a fixed blueprint we're stuck with. But epigenetics has shown us that's not the full story. Our life experiences can act like little dimmer switches on our genes, turning them up or down without ever changing the underlying DNA code itself. So how does that work? Well, one of the main ways is through something called DNA methylation. You can think of it like a little chemical tag that gets stuck onto a gene. Toxic stress from ACEs causes these tags to be placed all over our DNA. They can literally silence the genes that are supposed to help us calm down, basically breaking our body's off switch for stress. And at the exact same time, they can switch on genes that create chronic inflammation, which is a major cause of things like heart disease and diabetes. Our childhood experiences are literally leaving a chemical signature on our DNA. So now we can see the whole picture. We've connected the dots from a tough childhood to a stress response that's gone haywire to a physically altered brain and epigenetic changes. And that brings us to the top of that ACE pyramid, where all these biological changes finally show up as real-world health and social problems. And this biological domino effect has incredibly broad consequences. That chronic inflammation and those out-of-whack hormones, they lead directly to some of our biggest killers, like heart disease and cancer. The changes to the brain's architecture dramatically raise the risk for mental illnesses like depression and anxiety. And the impact on impulse control and decision-making can lead to major social problems, things like unemployment or poverty. It really touches almost every single part of a person's adult life. Now, I know this can all sound incredibly bleak, but the most important part of this whole story isn't the problem itself. It's what understanding the science behind it empowers us to do, because everything, absolutely everything, starts with knowing. This right here is the single biggest takeaway. This science completely changes how we should look at people who are struggling, whether it's with addiction or mental illness or chronic disease. It shows us that these things are often not the result of bad choices or a lack of willpower. They're the long-term symptoms of a biological injury that happened in childhood. And that understanding forces us to shift our question from a blaming "what's wrong with you" to a compassionate and much more helpful "what happened to you." And that one simple shift in perspective, it changes everything. It opens the door for better prevention in our schools, for more effective approaches in healthcare and our justice system, and for real personal healing. Because if we know that adversity gets under the skin and causes a physical injury, then it forces us to ask, how can we build a world that has more of the things that protect us from that injury, like safe, stable, nurturing relationships? How will this knowledge change our future? That's really the question this science leaves for all of us to answer.